Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. And I'd like to thank especially the previous speakers because I feel like our presentations meshed really well. So today I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a summary of the latest research on speed and speed control and some of the rationale for why those of us in the public health community think this is an issue that deserves so much attention. So, as Dr. Dinzar mentioned before, here in BC, we also keep statistics on motor vehicle crash fatalities and the top contributing factors. This is from the Provincial Health Officer's report in 2016. And the blue bar at the top is the relationship of speed as a contributing factor to fatalities in BC. And so you can see over the last few years, between 35 and 40% of road traffic fatalities are attributable to speed as a top contributing factor. But I would go farther and argue that speed is actually important in all of the fatalities and injuries that we have on our road. And earlier speakers also mentioned, when do we blame speed? Oftentimes when we're thinking about speeding, so exceeding the posted speed limit or driving too fast for conditions. But these are set relative to a human-designed speed limit, and that can be set in a variety of ways, as earlier folks mentioned. So I would argue that we actually need to think about speed's contribution in every single collision on our roads. And there's several reasons for this. One is the relationship of speed and the risk of injury and death. So this is a graph from Ramberg in 2005, and what this shows you in those three different curves across, at the bottom you have collision speed. On the left you have the risk of fatality going from 0 to 100%. Each bar represents a different type of collision. So the red one is a pedestrian collision with a vehicle. The green is a side impact collision. The blue is a head-on collision. And what you can see is that as the collision speed goes up, there's actually a very steep increase in the risk of fatality in each of these types of collisions. So despite the mitigating measures that we might have in a vehicle when it surrounds us in a collision or in a head-on collision, in every type of collision, we see a very steep curve relationship of increase in injury. And that's really because of what Neil mentioned, kinetic energy. The more kinetic energy there is in a collision, the more destructive it is. Various types of protections we have, seat belts, crumple zones, can disperse some of that energy, but fundamentally, the more kinetic energy there is in a collision, the greater impact it has on injuries and fatalities. So once a collision happens, we know the speed is critically important in the risk of injuries and fatalities. But something that often gets a little bit more controversy is the risk of a collision itself happening and its association with speed. We also know that speed has a strong relationship to the risk of collision, and part of this is just because of the physics of driving. So this is a graph from the Queensland government in 2016, and this illustrates some of the differences in stopping distances at various speeds. So you can see that the overall stopping distance at 50 kilometers an hour is about half the stopping distance of 80 kilometers an hour. And part of that is because human reaction time, there is an absolute minimum. You cannot get beyond a physiological minimum of reaction time. And so in that minimum reaction time that a driver has to respond to a risk of collision, their vehicle travels farther and farther the faster the speed is. And in addition, it just actually takes more braking distance to stop a faster traveling vehicle. So in addition to the stopping distance, changes in steering cause more dramatic vehicle movements at higher speeds. So really any driver's ability to respond to changing road conditions, to the behavior of other road users, to rectify a driver's own mistake or distraction, or their ability to respond to any unexpected event is diminished by higher speeds. There's also limitations in human capacity at higher speeds. So I mentioned that we have minimum reaction times and we can't get around that. That's just a limit of human physiology. But there's also actual limits to our perceptual abilities. So for example, when we're traveling at higher speeds, our vision actually changes. The central vision that we have narrows and blurs. We have decreased peripheral vision. So this illustration shows you sort of a cartoon to illustrate what a road driver might see at 15 miles per hour versus 30 miles per hour. So at higher speeds, drivers are actually less able to take in as much information about what's happening on the road, and therefore less able to avoid a collision in an unexpected scenario. Now you'll hear some people argue that they're more alert, they're more focused at higher speeds, that they're able to compensate for the challenges that I just identified. And there actually is evidence to suggest that drivers do attempt to compensate at particularly high speeds. So what does the empirical evidence say? Does it work? Are drivers able to compensate adequately? And what we find is clearly no. So these are a couple graphs from Elvik's review in 2013. On the left is a graph at the bottom of the speed associated with a collision and the risk of collision on the left. The left graph is for injury collisions, the right graph is for fatal collisions. And so what you can see is, as Neil mentioned, there's a nonlinear, actually exponential relationship between speed and the risk of collision. And the relationship is actually even more dramatic for fatal collisions as it is for injury collisions. So we've seen the evidence from massive systematic reviews that human drivers are not able to compensate for the higher risks associated with higher speeds. You'll also hear a lot of discussion about speed variance. And this is actually quite a complicated question. I don't have time to go into in detail today, but what I will say is that some of the older studies showed that there was a bit of a U-shaped curve of relationships between drivers going slower than the median speed, drivers going faster than the median speed, and an increased risk of collision on both sides. Those older studies actually had major methodological challenges, and more recent studies have demonstrated that driving faster than surrounding traffic does increase the risk of collision, but the evidence is inconclusive for slower. There's no reliable, quantified relationship for speed variance and collision risk. And additionally, driver surveys actually show that drivers have significant heterogeneity in their speed preferences. So our mechanisms for reducing speed variance are actually it's unlikely that letting drivers use their own preferences to set speed would actually decrease variance, as was proposed by some Ministry of Transportation here a few years ago. So coming from medicine, I would make an analogy of speed to other types of complex tasks. In other high-stakes activities, let's say surgery, we recognize that redundancy is critical. We don't set a pace that doesn't allow us to rectify mistakes. We understand that we need to be able to, in a routine surgery, give the time necessary to be able to do additional checks to avoid making mistakes. And I don't think any of us would tolerate a surgeon who is rushing through a surgery, just so we shouldn't tolerate speeds that are not set with safety in mind on our roads. Okay, so how should we address speed? In public health, we often think of broad sets of measures to address a problem. And I don't have time to talk about all of the huge range of excellent measures there are to address speed, so I'll just try to highlight a few different types of ways that we can address speed today. So oftentimes we hear people talk about education and social marketing. And of course, the advantage of these types of interventions is that they're not invasive, they're not as expensive up front as often other interventions, and meta-analyses of educational interventions do show that they can actually reduce speeding, at least temporarily. Of course, they do have limits in their reach. They're often time limited. They do have limits in their effectiveness. But I think what's really important about education and social marketing is that these types of measures can increase the support for other types of speed measures. So we often talk about the public's lack of support and engagement for other types of speed controls. Part of what we should be relying on education and social marketing is helping the public to understand how critical it is to limit speed, the impact it can have on their communities, and engaging them to support those types of measures. Design and infrastructure, of course, there's a huge wealth of interventions here. They are more expensive, but oftentimes held up as the ideal way to manage speed. So things like traffic calming through road bumps or roundabouts have amazing effects on reducing collisions. Roundabouts reductions in the realm of 40 to 50% of injury accidents. Transition zones that help signal to drivers when they're entering a new lower speed zone, so it's obvious to drivers how to behave. Self-explaining and self-enforcing roads is a sort of quickly developing concept now. This is the idea that self-enforcing roads signal to drivers how they should be driving, and they give them visual and perceptual signals that help them adapt and make the best speed decision in that area. So in the illustration on the right, you see that there's some painted lane markings that actually artificially narrow the lanes so that drivers perceive a narrower lane and are signaled to go slower. And speed limit setting. Our previous speakers talked a lot about why the 85th percentile is no longer considered the best standard. Of course, one of the main arguments for the 85th percentile was that it was a speed limit which most drivers will regard as credible, and it won't require a huge amount of enforcement. And so clearly, that's not an appropriate criteria for setting speed limits these days. We should be thinking about the geometric design of roads, what development there is alongside roads, minimizing travel costs. And when I talk about minimizing travel costs, I don't mean just the time it takes to point A to point B, but also the costs associated with injury, the costs associated with emissions and energy consumption. And then, of course, the biomechanical energy that humans can tolerate. And this goes back to those curves I showed you at the beginning. These are often referred to as Vision Zero speed limits. This is the idea that speed limits should be set to avoid any scenario in which a serious collision or fatality could emerge. And so, for example, in locations with potential conflicts between pedestrian and cars, the ideal speed limit would be 30 kilometers an hour. In roads with possible frontal impacts between cars, 70 kilometers an hour, and roads with no possibility of a side or frontal impact, 100 kilometers an hour or more. So in general, these actually do tend to imply lower speed limits than we see in most of the real world today. So how can we adopt these kinds of new speed limits? One of the campaigns that you'll see widely around the world is this concept of neighborhood 30. In places that use miles per hour, you'll often hear 20 is plenty. This is setting the default speed limit to 30 kilometers an hour in neighborhoods or places where there's likely to be a lot of pedestrian and vehicle conflict. And research has shown that setting neighborhood 30 speed limits can reduce serious injuries and fatalities by 35 to 38% for pedestrians and cyclists. So this, I think, is an area that can be very locally driven, a lot of community engagement, and so it's really an area where we have the potential to enact a lot of local change. Oftentimes we get a lot of questions about changing speed limits, what's actually going to be the response to changing speed limits. We do know that changing speed limits don't always change the average speed of drivers as much as the mean speed, as much as the actual speed limit change, but in part that depends on enforcement. And that's where I come to the less fun part of speed control. So in terms of enforcement techniques, there's a whole range of different enforcement techniques, ranging from the sort of softer faux enforcement of speed reader boards that alert people if they're following the law, going to the traditional realm of roadside tickets. And I think we've had a very illuminating discussion of why that can be such a challenge and how limited that roadside enforcement can be, and of course, automated enforcement. And automated enforcement, the literature is really clear on this, the systematic reviews are very clear on this. There's a very strong relationship between speed and enforcement and crashes. Automated enforcement is no different, it's very effective. But it's really important in any of these interventions to do them in a way that engages the public and that has public acceptability and is fair. So when we've done a review of the places around the world that have implemented automated speed enforcement successfully, we found a few common elements. One of those is no surprises. So while covert automated enforcement is effective, it is not in the long run successful in many places because there's a perception of unfairness. So the idea of no surprises is clear, consistent communication, both on site and at large, that automated enforcement is here and to be expected, and here are the thresholds where you will receive a ticket. Revenue transparency. So previous speakers alluded to the perception that automated enforcement and even traditional enforcement often is seen as a money grab. So it's really critical that governments, when they're implementing the automated enforcement and other types of technologies, that they identify where the revenue is going, oftentimes putting it back into road safety improvements. Some places have been creative and returned revenues in lotteries to good drivers. However you want to set it up, it's very critical that the objective of this program is to improve safety, and that's where the revenue is being dedicated. Site selection and evaluation. So again, with traditional enforcement, you often hear complaints about, this location, it's at the bottom of a hill. Same complaints about automated enforcement. Programs that have been successful have selected sites because of crash risk and evaluated those sites afterwards to ensure that they're achieving reductions in speed and reductions in collisions. And then they can legitimately say to the public, this objective was safety, and we've succeeded. And finally, community engagement. So this is an example from New South Wales where they actually enabled the public to nominate sites in their communities where they wanted automated speed enforcement. But community engagement is so critical. Letting people feel like they have a voice, that this is something that they can actually use as a positive force in their own communities, getting people involved in campaigning for lower speed limits. It's just critical for us to be able to be successful in gaining public acceptance. If people can participate and feel like this is not something imposed on them, but really something that they themselves would like for improving the safety of their own communities, then we will have a much more long-term successful ability to control speeds and address some of the problematic cultural memes about the acceptability of speeding in our communities. So I'll just close by quoting Sweden's Vision Zero. In every situation a person might fail, the road system should not. And I would say that we've got to think about how speed contributes to people failing in our road systems and enable them to succeed instead. And just some citations and photo citations. Thank you.